The bedroom window looked out toward the east. That detail remains clear in my mind because during those early months, before the physical weight of my condition made rest even more elusive, I used to stay awake just to catch the very first pale line of dawn creeping past the edge of the fabric. It was not that I anticipated the start of the day with joy. Rather, the morning meant he would finally get up from the bed, granting me a brief window of a few hours just to draw a full breath. At 22 years old, carrying my first pregnancy at just 7 weeks, I was already reduced to measuring my life by the intervals between his presence. I grew up inside the old order Amish community of Holmes County, Ohio. It has been 6 years since I walked away from that life, and this space is where I finally give voice to the truths my upbringing would have forced me to keep buried forever. If this account resonates with you or if you have lived through something similar, sharing your own reflections below helps break the isolation. Were you raised within a religious framework where a wife's physical form was never truly treated as her own property? I make sure to read every single thought shared here. It is essential to understand what an Amish husband is permitted to do while his wife is expecting a child, primarily because there are no explicit regulations, and that very vacuum of oversight functions as its own absolute law. In mainstream society, a pregnant woman is enveloped in a certain degree of cultural protection. People check on her well-being, husbands are advised to show tenderness, and there is an entire infrastructure of medical care, literature, and open dialogue dedicated to understanding the changes and requirements of her body. For a distinct period, her physical comfort becomes a priority. Within my upbringing, however, carrying a child carried a vastly different meaning. It simply signified that you had successfully executed your primary role. The bishop made this clear from the pulpit, preaching that a woman's physical self is surrendered first to her husband and secondly to God, with the resulting children serving as the ultimate proof of both devotions. Pregnancy did not alter your daily reality. It was merely the realization that the system was functioning precisely as intended. The cooking, the cleaning, and the expectations of marriage continued without interruption, exactly as the Ordnung demanded. The life forming within you was never viewed as a justification to stop and rest, but rather as a mandate for deeper gratitude. When I was 20, I wed Daniel, who was 26 at the time. He possessed 200 acres of land, held an unblemished standing in the community, and had hands that seemed entirely incapable of remaining idle. He was not the kind of person who paused to consider if a task was overly demanding. His only metric was whether the work had been completed. Our time of courtship had been brief, spanning just 6 months of Sunday evening encounters, where his buggy would arrive at our lane before the sun dipped below the horizon. My mother's fresh bread always sat on the table between us, acting as an unspoken chaperone. Our conversations revolved around the operations of the farm, his designs for the back acreage, and the number of offspring the Lord might grant us. He expressed a desire for a large family, and I concurred, entirely unaware of the reality behind the concepts I was endorsing. Our wedding took place on a late Thursday in October, an affair of 300 guests and 4 hours spent enduring hard wooden benches while the bishop delivered a sermon focused entirely on the concept of yielding. By December, I was expecting. I want to choose my words with immense care here because I have spent a long time in therapy learning how to categorize my experiences with absolute precision, and truthfulness matters more to me now than anything else. Daniel was never a man of physical violence, and I state this clearly so the nature of my experience is not misunderstood. He never lifted a hand against me, nor did he ever raise his voice in a manner that caused the children to cower. His actions were far quieter than that, making them much more difficult to define because our world had already given his behavior an approved label. The community called it headship. They called it the divine order, and they viewed it simply as the natural rights of a husband. In old order congregations, a woman's complete compliance with her husband's wishes is not a piece of advice. It is foundational theology. The Ordnung does not itemize this expectation in a written document you can reference. Instead, it exists in the very atmosphere. You feel it in the silent gazes of the older matriarchs when you mention being weary, and you feel it in the heavy quiet that fills the room during a quilting frolic when your hands tremble from a total lack of sleep the night before. A wife does not deny her husband. That is a rule that remains unspoken precisely because it requires no vocalization. Every young woman understands it completely by the time she takes her vows. You learn it by observing your mother, and you learn it from the absolute absence of the topic during church services, which serves as a powerful lesson in itself. Within the framework of the Ordnung, silence indicates that a matter is entirely settled and beyond question. I was only 7 weeks into my pregnancy when a specific concept first entered my mind, though I would not find the exact terminology for it until years later, while sitting in a neutral-colored therapy office in Columbus, Ohio. The word I was looking for was coercion. Back then, I lacked that vocabulary. All I understood at the moment was that this endurance was what faithfulness required, and to doubt it was equivalent to doubting God himself. My friend Rebecca had entered marriage 2 years ahead of me, delivering her first baby at 19 and her second just 14 months afterward. In the early stages of my own pregnancy, while the two of us were sitting on her back porch shelling beans, I confessed to her that I was experiencing a level of exhaustion that felt entirely beyond explanation. It surpassed the relentless nausea that plagued my mornings. It was a deeper fatigue that seemed to nestle right behind my eyes. She stared at me for a lengthy interval without uttering a sound, before finally remarking softly that things become more manageable after the 3rd month. She was not referring to the physical tiredness, but to the internal struggle. When I pressed her to explain what she meant, she simply turned her focus back to the beans in her lap. The realization hit me then, settling heavily in my chest like a solid rock, because she was not offering me hope that the situation would improve. She was acknowledging that she recognized my exact torment, and that she had simply learned how to detach herself from it. Becoming numb to it was the only relief available. That brief exchange, lasting a mere 16 seconds on a porch, was the most transparent conversation I ever had with any woman in my community during those 8 months. And even then, the deepest truths were left entirely unspoken. The arrival of the 3rd month offered no respite. I kept returning to Rebecca's words, holding on to them and searching my own interior for the capacity to tune out the reality of my existence. Yet my physical form was shifting in ways that left me feeling far more exposed and sensitive, rather than insulated. My skin felt altered, and my sense of smell became so incredibly sharp that the mere odor of kerosene from the unlit lamps would cause me to feel intensely ill. The fatigue I carried felt rooted in my very marrow. Despite all of this, nothing in my routine changed. I actually attempted to speak to my mother once, a decision I nearly avoided because one simply did not approach their mother with dilemmas of this nature. A daughter might seek counsel for a sick infant, a ruined crop, or a tangible grief, but never for the private realities of a marriage. Yet, I went anyway. I explained my situation with great care, using the limited vocabulary I possessed at the time rather than the clearer terms I would learn later. I told her I was floundering, that my exhaustion felt far more profound than ordinary pregnancy, and that I spent my nights counting the hours until the dawn just to survive the dark. She gave me her attention, though her hands never paused their rhythm for a single second. She was busy repairing a shirt belonging to my father, her needle piercing the cloth in tiny, disciplined movements. Once I finished speaking, she stated that Daniel was a decent man. She reminded me that my home was well heated, my root cellar was full, and my husband was free from the vices of drinking or infidelity. She explained that my fatigue was simply the natural result of harboring a new life, which she called a holy and demanding burden, assuring me that the Almighty would provide the necessary endurance if I requested it with a spirit of true Gelassenheit. With that, she passed the repaired garment back to me, and requested that I bring her the remaining mending during my next visit on Friday, effectively concluding our interaction. During the journey home, with my hands guiding the reins as the October fields turned a deep golden brown on both sides of the road, I confronted the reality of having absolutely no place of refuge. My mother was far from a cold-hearted person. In truth, she was the most affectionate individual I had ever known in almost every other aspect of life. Yet the institution of marriage formed a barrier she either could not perceive or refused to acknowledge, and even today, I remain uncertain which was the truth. The 5th month brought me to the absolute edge of my endurance. By that stage, my changing shape was obvious enough to draw the attention of the women at worship, leading to quiet well wishes after the conclusion of the service. They would place gentle hands on my arm and inquire if I was wishing for a son or a daughter. I would offer a smile and respond that my only wish was for a healthy infant, which was the absolute truth. I felt a protective love for the life developing within me that was so fierce, it genuinely startled me at times. Yet I was surviving on almost no sleep, constantly processing the internal math that Daniel either failed to see or deliberately ignored. It was the calculus of what was being demanded from a physical body that was simultaneously constructing a new human being, cell by cell, while maintaining an entire household, all while being expected to remain completely accessible each night in the precise manner a wife was deemed obligated to be. The equations simply never balanced, and they never had. I lacked the terminology to express this crisis, possessing nothing but a profound, bone-deep weariness, and that bedroom window looking out toward the east. I did try to communicate this to him on one occasion, not through an open confrontation, as defiance was an option I had never been taught to utilize. Instead, I attempted to broach the subject with gentleness, much like one might point out a fracturing piece of a leather harness before it snaps entirely. I confessed to him that I was deeply fatigued, that the pregnancy was becoming physically heavy, and that real rest had eluded me for weeks. He looked back at me with an expression that carried no malice whatsoever, and I want to be entirely clear about that fact. It was not an act of cruelty. Rather, it was the completely vacant stare of a man who had been raised entirely within a marital framework that simply did not account for such a variable. A wife's personal comfort occupied no column in the ledger of responsibilities he had been trained to follow. He had been taught precisely what a husband is supposed to provide and what a wife is supposed to surrender, and that instruction had been reinforced so thoroughly throughout his life that my exhaustion existed entirely outside the boundaries of his perception. He murmured that he understood, suggested I try to find time for a nap during daylight hours, and then the evening proceeded exactly as every other evening always did. There was an elder in our district whom I will refer to as Ruth. She was in her 60s during my first pregnancy, a lifelong member of the community who had raised 7 children of her own, buried one, and labored alongside her husband for 4 decades on a homestead that commanded universal respect. She carried an innate authority that required no outward display. One afternoon when I was 6 months along, she arrived at my kitchen to assist me in processing the remaining harvest of apples. For 3 hours, we labored side by side, our conversation drifting through topics like her grandchildren, the arrival of the first frost, and whether the newly selected deacon would prove capable. It was casual talk, the sort of dialogue that glides over deeper realities like water moving beneath a sheet of ice. Eventually, without turning her gaze toward me, she remarked that the final stretch of pregnancy always proves to be the most challenging. I agreed that it was. She then mentioned that certain women found it beneficial to occupy the guest bedroom during those concluding weeks, framing it as a matter of better sleep since a larger belly could make the main bed overly crowded. My hands never paused in their task, and I kept my eyes forward, mirroring her posture. She noted that her own mother had utilized this exact arrangement during her final 2 pregnancies, calling it a highly practical measure. She added that some husbands possessed the wisdom to realize that practicality could be the highest form of kindness during specific times of life. I offered no verbal response, and she simply handed me the next jar to cap. In that singular moment, she handed me the most significant gift I received across those entire 8 months. It was not an outright remedy, nor was it an official dispensation from any elder, because no institutional approval existed for such an arrangement. What she offered me instead was the profound realization that other women had successfully navigated these waters by quietly carving out private sanctuaries within the encompassing silence. She showed me that acting practically could serve as an alternative language, allowing a woman to express through the physical choice of a separate room what she was strictly forbidden from putting into words. I transitioned into the separate bedroom during my 7th month of pregnancy, attributing the move entirely to the physical awkwardness of my size and my restless nights. Daniel received the explanation in the same manner he handled all functional adjustments. He did not favor the arrangement, but he acquiesced to it. For a period of 6 weeks, I truly rested. I slept with a depth that felt like a slow recovery from an ongoing trauma. I would awaken before the first light of dawn, listening to the movements of the livestock in the barn below, feeling the child stir beneath my palm, and contemplating the kind of woman I would raise her to be if she entered the world as a daughter. I wondered what vocabulary I could gift her that had been entirely withheld from me. She was indeed a girl, and we chose the name Hannah for her. I finally fled the community when she reached 2 years of age, and her younger brother Elias was only 3 months old. The resulting Meidung was instantaneous and absolute. My mother ignored my attempts to reach her, until eventually I stopped trying altogether, and my correspondence was returned unopened. The entrance to the home of my childhood was barred against me with a finality that felt like a physical blow to the chest. Eventually, I established a relationship with a counselor in Columbus, a petite woman who constantly misplaced her reading glasses and possessed a remarkably direct manner of inquiry. During our 3rd appointment, I related the events of those 8 months using the only language I had at my disposal, words that lacked clinical precision but were entirely truthful. She gave me her full attention without a single interruption, and when I finished speaking, she sat in silence for a brief interval. She then looked at me and stated that the experience I was articulating had an actual name. I have returned to that sentence nearly every single day since it was spoken. I had existed for nearly 3/4 of a year within a reality that my culture had intentionally stripped of any defining vocabulary, and that very absence of language was the instrument of control. When a concept lacks a name, it is treated as non-existent. If it does not exist, there is no possibility of resisting it, and if resistance is impossible, a woman who survives it is merely fulfilling her duty as a faithful spouse, while the man who enforces it is merely acting as a husband should. The Ordnung has no need for written decrees. That is the entire philosophy behind its power. Now, with 6 years of distance behind me and 2 children who are being brought up with an entirely different vocabulary than the one I was given, I see the truth clearly. Daniel was never a monster. He was simply a human being completely sculpted by a cultural apparatus that prevented him from seeing his wife's body as an independent entity with its own distinct boundaries and requirements. That realization is not meant to absolve him. It is simply an analysis of how incredibly commonplace structural harm can be. It demonstrates how such dynamics can exist right alongside a successful harvest, a comfortable home, and a partner who remains sober and faithful. It shows how a completely ordinary existence can be constructed upon a foundation that is never interrogated, simply because the act of questioning was never presented as a viable path. Ruth offered me a temporary sanctuary of 6 weeks, while my mother was unable to offer me even a moment of validation. The religious institution provided nothing but dogma, and the Ordnung offered only its absolute quiet. Hannah has reached her 8th year now, and she is an incredibly inquisitive child, always demanding to know the reasons, the methods, the definitions, and wanting to investigate everything with her own eyes. Every single time she poses a question, I make sure to provide an answer, even on the occasions when the explanation eludes me, and most especially during those moments. To anyone who was molded in a setting where your physical self was never acknowledged as your own, your reality is recognized. If you were taught that submission under duress was the definition of holiness, and that speaking up for yourself was an act of hochmut, your struggle is seen. If you manage to claim a separate space for yourself under the guise of necessity because no other concepts were permitted to you, that resourcefulness is acknowledged as well. You were never weak for doing whatever was required to endure your circumstances. You were simply navigating your reality with the scarce tools you were permitted, and what you were given was never sufficient. That deficiency was never your responsibility. This is the narrative of a journey toward autonomy. Guard your personal independence with the utmost care, for it is the very thing that has the power to rescue you.